Healing our wounded inner child is definitely one of the most important parts of ourselves to heal if we want to live a much more joyful life, and it will inevitably show up at many stages during our healing path. As a matter of fact, it shows up in your life all the time, most likely every single day in different triggering situations. Almost every time that little kid inside of us shows up, we fail to acknowledge them, and instead we blame ourselves for behaving childishly, believing that there is something wrong with us. That's why last week I made a video where all we did was talk about who or what the inner child is. If you didn't watch it yet, I do recommend you to go check out that first, as it will give you the right context for this video. The link is up here or in the description below. In that video, we talked about what it is and why it shows up. Today, let's talk about the necessary steps to heal it and what to do when it shows up asking for attention. Let's get right into it. Hi there, I'm Iván, and after a decade of facilitating healing ceremonies and witnessing thousands and thousands of people process their trauma, I noticed that the healing process pretty much can never be complete unless we do something at some point that it is known as inner child work. But we can't really start talking about what that work is unless we really understand who and what that inner child is. So I will insist in you watching the video I made on that topic first. As a recap, the wounded inner child is a past version of you who experienced a traumatic experience where your emotional needs have gone unmet, creating a wound that it is constantly seeking to be soothed. Since the wound was experienced by you as a child, that child is still within you, and it follows you everywhere you go, popping up every now and then asking for attention, in the ways in which that child's pain would have felt better in that past situation when the wound was created. Okay, so that's a very summarized version of last week's video, skipping all the important nuance. Now that we know what it is and why it shows up, in this video we'll talk about ways in which it comes out, why is it important to develop a relationship with them, reparenting our wounded inner child, what to do when it shows up and how to care for it, and last, how to heal it. Before we do this, let's talk really quickly about what triggers are, as it will help us understand the wounded inner child much better. A trigger is a situation that, for whatever reason, reminds you of a past traumatizing experience, bringing up the feelings experienced back then. When I say it reminds you, I don't mean necessarily consciously. You might not know that this process is happening inside you, but your body and your emotions do. The situation might be completely unrelated, yet if anything about it, even the slightest similarity, brings up the emotions of a past traumatizing experience, then that is called a trigger. One way to know that you're being triggered is to notice if your emotional reaction to a situation is much bigger than what the situation objectively calls for. And that is not necessarily something easy to do at first, because it is really hard to separate your subjective experience from the objective one. But with time, we can get much better at identifying it. If we talk about explosives, it is not the trigger that's creating the explosion. The explosion happens because, well, there are explosives connected to the trigger. Without the explosives, you could push the trigger as much as you want and nothing would happen. A trigger is nothing else than a button connected to a wire connected to explosives. Emotions work exactly the same way. Let's say that somebody is being passive-aggressive to me and to you. Maybe you don't care, or maybe you don't even notice it, but for me, it might become emotionally explosive, making me extremely upset. That is because this passive-aggressive person might remind me, consciously or not, of how much pain I experienced in my household because of my passive-aggressive mother. But if you did not have that experience, it might simply do nothing for you. Or maybe you do get upset, but your level of upset matches the level of intensity of the situation. Whereas for me, I might get extremely upset, much more than what the situation calls for. For you, it would be like a button that is not connected to anything. It is not about the present situation, but about which past experience this present situation is or is not triggering. So with that out of the way, let's talk about a few examples in which the inner wounded child shows up for me. By taking a quick look at my wounding, you might be able to identify it easier when it shows up for you. When I was a kid, I was bullied a lot. That created many different wounds, and each one of these wounds is associated with a different emotion. I will name several of them so that you can understand how many wounded inner children live inside a person, all of them stemming from the same traumatizing experience, which in this case is being bullied. The first one is through the feeling of sadness that the world is not as safe and loving place as I wish it would. That is my past experience. Today, when an unrelated situation reminds me that the world is not as safe and loving, which is also a trigger, that exact same sadness shows up. That emotion does not belong to adult me, but to little me. Basically, my wounded inner child shows up through that emotion. I can even venture to say that the wounded inner child is the emotion. It is the emotion experienced by you in the past, showing up in the present moment. The trigger could be something super simple. For example, it personally drives me completely crazy when people honk at each other unless it is truly for safety reasons. But when it is done out of sheer violence, I totally lose my marbles. Now, I know that this is a trigger because the situation objectively is not that big. Somebody got upset and honked, but subjectively it is huge for me because it brings in me my wounds around the world being unsafe and unkind. That type of world inflicted a lot of pain in me as a child, and so that child shows up when somebody honks for no reason in the form of an intense emotion, which is sadness. And I can't control it. What I can control are my actions. For example, I can ignore it, I can take a breath, I can do nothing. But those are all adult behaviors. But what I can't control is the sadness that shows up automatically. That is my inner little me. When little me shows up, he wants something. That's why he's showing up. And these are the things that he really wants. To feel the world is kind and safe. To be soothed. To be seen. To be held. Who is he asking those things from, or who can give those things to him? Wanna take a guess? Here is the answer. Literally anyone. If any person manages to hold that child in the ways in which he needs it and is asking for, then that pain would stop and a part of it might even heal. However, that is really hard because almost no one can truly see someone else's inner child unless that is a person trained to do so and knows you really well. So, who's the most likely person to give that to that child? You. Adult you, which is a separate person from little you. Adult you, in this case, becomes your inner child's parent. And, like any parent, adult you can be a really good parent or a negligent one. I have some bad news. Most of the times, adult you is a really crappy parent. Why is that? Because, in order to be a good parent to your inner child, you first need to know of its existence, and most people have absolutely no clue about what the inner child even is. Which is why I'm making these videos. Imagine any child looking at their father, and their father doesn't even notice their existence. That is a terrible form of parenting. So noticing the child's existence is already doing much better than most people. Noticing your inner child works the same way as if you would be noticing an outer child, as if that would be your actual son or daughter. You can talk and communicate with them. You can even ask them questions and wait for answers. It is pretty amazing. So, learning how to properly parent your inner child is essential for them to heal. Once they do, they will not be a separate part of you anymore. They will reintegrate into your body and they will stop seeking for attention. The situations that could have been triggering will not be anymore, as the button will not be connected to any explosives. So, how do we heal it? The first step we already talked about, which is to acknowledge that you are being triggered by saying something like, I can see that in this moment I am experiencing emotions that are stronger than what this situation objectively calls for. The second step is to follow the path of the trigger down to the emotion, which in our analogy was the explosives. Which emotion are you really feeling? If you can, name it. Naming an emotion is essential to understand what is actually going on with you. Third, notice that the emotion most likely does not belong to adult you, even though you are experiencing it in the present. It belongs to the little you of the past. So can you see which situations in your childhood made you feel exactly the same way in which you're feeling now? This is important because if you do, then you will notice the existence of your wounded inner child. Remember that child shows up through an unresolved past emotion, so noticing the emotion is noticing the child. Remember what happens when you don't notice the child? That was really poor parenting. So not noticing the emotion is also poor parenting. The act of noticing already will bring a lot of relief, as it will be most likely the first time that child feels finally seen, acknowledged, and even cared for, as you're actually caring for noticing their existence. Fourth, reparent them. To do that, forget about the wounded inner child and pretend that they are a real external person, like your son or daughter, or nephew or niece, or whatever you want. Then ask yourself, what would they need in that moment? If you have no clue what they need, then spend a little bit of time with them. Or you can also simply ask, what do you need right now? And then wait for an answer. They might talk to you slowly, or they might need some time to feel safe as they are not used to feeling seen and cared for, as we have spent most of our lives ignoring them. In the example I gave before about myself, I said that when somebody honks for no reason, my inner child needs to feel that the world is kind and safe, to be soothed, seen and held. Unfortunately, I cannot give him that first one. The world is not kind and safe at all times, but I can at the very least tell him that. Even though the world isn't kind and safe at all times in the way in which you wish, it is sometimes kind and safe to you. You might not get that kindness all the time from everyone, but at the very least, you are getting it right now from me. Doing that can also take care of the soothing and feeling seen. I can then do the other thing that he asked for, which is to be held. That works as if I would be literally holding my son. But since my wounded inner child is using my body to express himself, then what I do is I hold my own body while I connect to him. It's okay. It's okay. If you have never done inner child work, then this might sound a little bit out there. But it works because you are emotionally holding the parts of yourself that have been ignored for a very long time. That by itself can be very healing. I see it work all the time. I've seen it work in thousands of people. What is the other option anyway? Ignoring them? Trust me, you already tried that option for most of your life. Yet you are still behaving childishly, and sometimes you get emotions that are much stronger than what the situation calls for, right? I am sorry, but there is no escape to this. We cannot keep ignoring it. All we can do is start the process of reparenting. Doing inner child work is a lifelong process because we have as many wounded inner children as emotional unmet needs at different ages. How many do you think those are? A few? A dozen? Maybe 50 or 100? No. I would venture to say that we have literally thousands of unmet emotional needs stemming from a myriad of different moments at different ages, and so we have thousands of wounded inner children. Some of my wounded inner children show up all the time, several times a day. Now, if you think that that is too much or that I am really f***ed up, well, you might be right. But that is true for almost every person. I just learned how to identify it really well, even in almost imperceptible moments. Inner children show up all the time, every day. But once you are used to acknowledging them in the same way in which you would acknowledge your son or daughter when they are in need of something, then it isn't complicated anymore. We just need to learn and develop that practice, and at some point it will be almost automatic. Here are a few other examples of wounded inner children that I personally have, so that it becomes very, very clear. I am not triggered by anger. What this means is that you can be angry at me and I will not go into child mode. But I am extremely triggered by blame. So I would prefer you to be very, very angry at me, but not blame me for your anger, than to be mildly angry at me and blame me for it. Blame makes me blind. Adult me disappears and little me takes over the steering wheel of my consciousness and I go immediately into protective mode. Because of this practice, I learn now how to identify that very quickly. So when that happens, I immediately start talking to him. It's okay, I know how hard it is to be blamed. I'm here with you, you're not alone, you're being seen in how difficult this is for you. I learned to talk to him like that because I know him really well by now, but it took a while to get to know him that well and many failed attempts. Sometimes it is really hard to do this because it is little you who's having all these thoughts and making all the decisions in that moment, and there might be such little space for adult you to do literally anything. It takes practice, but it is such an incredible tool to master. With time, I became less sensitive to blame because of how much I made that kid feel safe, seen and held when he's being blamed. I'm not all the way there yet because this is a core wound for me, but I made significant progress and I know that I will continue to do so. I will finish with one happy story about my inner child. The point of all the examples and stories that I'm giving is for you to see all the ways in which they show up. The more you hear them, the easier it will be for you to identify them within yourself, and thus it will be easier for you to acknowledge them, which, remember, it is the bare minimum that we can do for them. Okay, so here's a story. If you didn't know yet, I am from Argentina, and at the time of this recording, it has been 2 years since Argentina won the World Cup in Qatar in 2022. No, even though it might seem like it, this story is not about football. It is a story about my wounded inner child. When Argentina won that World Cup, I remember that as one of the most amazing and meaningful moments of my life. And I can assure you, I had really profound and powerful experiences in my life, especially as a plant medicine facilitator. Yet, this definitely sits in my top 10. As exaggerated as this might sound, especially coming from somebody who is not a fan of football, then this might not make sense to you yet, but it will soon. To understand it, we need to go back to little Iván's psyche growing up. For those of you who don't know, Argentina's main religion is football. It is one of the things that matter by far the most there. Growing up, I saw how everybody was so proud that an Argentinian was considered the best player in history. It cemented that that's where my attention should go. Now, the World Cup happens once every 4 years. And every 4 years, I would always hear the same thing. Argentina is the best team in the world, and we will win this World Cup for sure. As a child, I didn't know any better, so I was convinced that would happen, but then we wouldn't win. I didn't understand why. Weren't we the best and the ones supposed to win? I remember how painful it was, the disappointment of not winning in 1994 when I was 8. I remember that pain perfectly. It felt almost like death. But those feelings weren't really mine. I was picking up in what it felt like for all the adults around me. That's what it felt like for everyone else and the society surrounding me, so it felt like that for me too. Imagine being a child and seeing everybody cry and grab their heads and be depressed, and it was crazy. Basically, I learned from everybody else that that is how it should feel like for me as well. And then, 4 years later, the same thing happens. Illusion, 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 deep disappointment. And then 4 years later the same, and then the same, and the same. Every time the big illusion and reassurance that this year for sure it's ours, and then a big and painful disappointment. The other element in this story is that our economy kept getting worse and worse for every year that it has passed. When I was born, Argentina has been the best it has been since I am alive. Every subsequent year, we have been doing worse than the year before. So this created a very specific wound that I can label it as good things cannot happen to Argentinians. The combination of this economy with the constant disappointment in football, which remember, it was taught to me that was the most important thing ever, cemented these feelings in me. This became a core wound in my emotional body, and it is one of my most prominent wounded inner children. This wounded inner child is expressed through the feeling good things can't happen to Argentinians, and therefore good things cannot happen to me. That's deep, and it hurts. That wound is a reason why I left my country. When I was 14, I already knew that I wanted to move out, and I was willing to do whatever it took to get out of there. And I did when I was 23. Then in 2014, Argentina made it all the way to the finals of the World Cup, and that was the very first time that I saw my country in a World Cup final. Could that be it? A part of me simply just couldn't believe it, because good things can't happen to Argentinians was an already deep and established wound. We tied, and so we went to extra time, and 3 minutes before the end of the game, Germany scored, and that was the end of the whole dream for us. That made it so much worse. It was like a tease, just a way of getting your hopes up to only later reinforce the idea that we are cursed and that it will never happen to us. Alright, then fast forward to 2022 and we make it to the finals again. We are winning for most of the game, and right before the end, they tie. And I'm like, of course they tie right before the end, because it actually cannot happen for us. The game ends in a tie, and so we go to penalty shootouts. We immediately start winning until we reach the final penalty kick. If we score, we are world champions. What I experienced when we won was not adult me. It was little me. It was the belief good things cannot happen to Argentinians being destroyed in literally a fraction of a second. It was me being at 8 experiencing everyone's feeling of death finally being relieved. It was the wound that made me want to leave my family and my country behind, that there is no hope for us finally getting some sort of redemption. For me, it was not about football or about winning. It was about bringing hope to that little child. And it wasn't adult me who yelled and cried. It was little me using my adult body to express what hope feels like after 3 decades of hopelessness around my identity. So many of my friends who saw my reaction there couldn't understand how could somebody who teaches meditation and serves in healing settings could get so worked up around football. Well, now you know. It wasn't really me, and it wasn't about football. It was little me, and it was about now knowing that good things can happen. Wow! Good things can happen to Argentinians. Good things can happen to me. I wish there would be a recording of me in that moment, but unfortunately I wasn't there anymore. Instead, what I have is a recording of my inner child using my adult body to express himself. So if you'd like, I can show you that. Are you curious about that moment? Check it out.
Yes. Okay. Imagine being that guy. He's got the championship. How can you be that guy? How can you do that? How can you be that guy? Vamos, Argentina campeón. Argentina campeón. Argentina campeón.
Please, just do this.
I hope that you will care for your inner children as much as they deserve. They are all beautiful parts of you seeking for the attention that they never got. If you learn to love them the way they always deserved, you will become a much more wholesome and integrated person. You will learn to see and love other people's wounded inner children and ultimately live a much richer and fulfilling life. I hope that you enjoyed this video and that you learned more about how to treat your inner children and how to help them heal. You can get a summary of this video completely for free, put together beautifully in a PDF so that you can refresh your memory around the topics presented here anytime that you want. To get it, check out the link in the description below. If you would like to support the channel, liking and subscribing does just that for me, and it helps you not miss out the content that I put out. Last, I'd like to say a big thank you to all of my Patreon supporters, and I will see you next week. Bye! Click on the left square to watch another video I made on a related topic. All my content is free. If you appreciate it and wish to assist me to continue releasing this kind of content, please consider supporting me on Patreon. You can also follow me on my socials and subscribe to this channel.